This is The Board Next Door, the podcast. Before we begin, a note. This episode presents commentary on documented allegations contained in official filings and records relating to Imperial House condominium in Miami Beach, Florida. All factual claims are sourced to specific documents cited in the show notes. These are allegations, not adjudicated facts. The individuals and entities discussed have denied the allegations or will have an opportunity to respond in the appropriate legal forums. Voices in this podcast are AI-generated. Opinions expressed are those of the host, Ricardo Battaglino, a unit owner at Imperial House, speaking about the governance of his own building. This podcast is not legal advice. Today's episode, social cleansing. What's the endgame? So imagine you decide it's time to sell your home, you put it on the market, you find a willing buyer who offers full asking price, and you're ready to close.
Sounds like a dream scenario.
Exactly. But then a letter arrives from your condo board, and it doesn't cite a credit score issue or like a background check failure. Yeah, it implies your buyer, simply because they need a standard mortgage, just isn't successful or interesting enough to fit the community's vibe, and the sale is blocked.
Wow, that's a nightmare.
Right. But today, we are looking at a real documented email exchange from February 2025, where this isn't just a hypothetical nightmare for a seller. It's actually a proposed governing philosophy.
And we're unpacking a really severe internal clash here between two individuals, Ron and Nick, over the future of the Imperial House condominium.
Yeah, and the mission here is to unpack these emails, right? To explore this intense clash between a board member's vision for financial preservation versus the just extraordinary legal and ethical liabilities that vision might create.
Absolutely. Because what makes this stack of emails so compelling is that it strips away the usual, trivial disputes we associate with condo boards.
Right, like parking spaces or pool hours.
Exactly. We aren't talking about that stuff. We are diving into the existential mechanics of coastal real estate.
Yeah.
We're looking at a scenario where the staggering multi-million-dollar costs of basic physical survival things like climate resilience, concrete restoration, wind insurance are colliding violently with the ethics of exclusivity.
So let's start with the immediate crisis driving this whole conversation, because before we get to the controversial statements that, sparked the title of this deep dive, we need to understand the physical and financial upkeep of the building.
Right, the actual concrete.
Yeah, the concrete. Ron's initial email to Nick is this fierce, unyielding defense of the board's decisions regarding insurance. And honestly, reading the first half of Ron's argument, I found myself nodding along.
He's laying out the brutal math of maintaining a building on the Florida coast.
He is. He emphasizes the necessity of maintaining wind coverage because, he poses this hypothetical to Nick. If they dropped it to save a few $100,000 and a hurricane hit, would owners be pleased spending millions on repairs?
And the mechanism he's describing there is a very real gamble that coastal boards face every single year.
Oh, for sure.
When insurance premiums balloon into the millions, the temptation is always to self-insure, to just drop the wind coverage, save that cash up front, and pray a hurricane doesn't hit.
That's terrifying.
It is. Ron is framing the board's strictness as the ultimate fiduciary shield against absolute financial ruin. If they drop the coverage and a storm tears the roof off, the owners aren't just out the premium savings. They are suddenly on the hook for millions of dollars in out-of-pocket special assessments.
And he backs that up with an incredible piece of data. Ron notes that their 2024 insurance premium was actually lower than 2023.
Which, given the Florida market, is practically a miracle.
Right. Seeing a premium go down right now is like spotting a unicorn. And Ron attributes this entirely to the board making, quote, appropriate improvements to the building.
Underwriters don't lower premiums out of the goodness of their hearts. They do it when the actuarial risk decreases.
Exactly.
So Ron is essentially saying our relentless spending on proper contractors and materials is the only reason the insurance market hasn't entirely abandoned us.
And he uses that victory to launch a really blistering critique of past leadership. He blames prior boards for a, quote, non-warrantable condition.
That's a huge red flag in real estate.
It is. He claims they prioritize keeping maintenance costs down over hiring qualified contractors, and he says he was shocked the building hasn't suffered horrible damage.
He is diagnosing a systemic failure of deferred maintenance there. Because when you defer maintenance on a coastal property, you aren't just delaying a paint job.
Right, it's not cosmetic.
No, saltwater intrusion begins to compromise the rebar inside the concrete. It spalls, it cracks, it literally loses its structural integrity.
And Ron's blunt conclusion on all these costs is basically living on the beach is expensive and costs will never go down. If owners find that unappealing, he says, perhaps they ought to look for a place more inland.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. Because it's like inheriting a classic car that's been held together with duct tape for decades.
I like that analogy.
Right. The new mechanic looks at it and says it needs a total rebuild from the ground up. But the owners are furious about the massive bill. So I have to ask you, is Ron just delivering a harsh dose of reality about Florida real estate? Or is he using structural safety as a shield for something else?
Well, what's fascinating here is the tension between a board's fiduciary duty to physically protect the asset and the massive financial strain it places on the actual residents.
Yeah.
I mean, you can validate the logic of Ron's insurance argument. He's not wrong about the concrete. But that move inland comment, it signals a much deeper philosophical shift about who belongs in the building.
Exactly. And that naturally bleeds into his opinions on the financial status of the people buying into the building, which leads us to the most explosive part of the email.
The transition from structural safety to social engineering.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting, because let's look at his specific paragraph on financing. Ron writes, quote, "I don't care whether or not a purchaser can finance their purchase."
In the context of a condo board, that is a stunning admission.
Right. Usually boards want to see good financing.
Typically, yeah.
Yeah.
A board reviews a buyer's financials to ensure they have the liquidity to pay their monthly dues. A strong financing package backed by a major bank is usually a green light. It shows financial health.
But Ron has this nostalgia for the past. He remembers a time when the board did not approve purchasers who needed financing and when nobody rented out their units.
He's advocating for a closed-loop economy of ultra wealth.
Yeah. And highlight Ron's specific phrasing here. This is a direct quote. "Our building was made up of successful and interesting owners. Perhaps we ought to return to that policy."
Successful and interesting owners.
I mean, how exactly does a board measure if a buyer is interesting?
They don't. Or, well, they shouldn't.
Right. It sounds like an exclusive, old-school country club masquerading as a modern residential building.
This raises an important question, though, because there's a massive difference between enforcing strict financial requirements like, proof of funds or a debt-to-income ratio, and using highly subjective qualitative judgments to screen your neighbors.
Yeah, interesting isn't a number on a bank statement.
Exactly. And you have to note how Ron connects the physical longevity of the building directly to the social makeup of its residents. He claims the current board is focused on repairing the building to last another 60 years, not wanting to spend a penny more than necessary, but refusing to sacrifice doing the right thing just to save a few bucks.
So for him, doing the right thing for the concrete means finding interesting cash buyers.
That's his logic. He sees exclusivity as a structural requirement.
But obviously that vision does not land well with everyone. Which brings us to Nick's alarmed reaction.
Yeah, Nick's response is where the liability aspect just blows up.
Nick forwards Ron's message to Michael Raines, and Nick states he is, quote, very conflicted and finds Ron's vision very concerning.
That's putting it mildly.
Seriously. And Nick points out that some might interpret Ron's stance as criminal. He says that as a real estate professional, Ron's statement, quote, reeks of steering and redlining.
Using words like steering and redlining in a documented email thread that's huge.
It's a massive escalation.
It is, because Nick is recognizing the mechanical effects of redlining here. Even if it's not explicit racial bias, a blanket ban on financing combined with a subjective interestingness test creates an artificial, illegal barrier to housing.
And Nick argues that the board has a fiduciary duty to its members. He literally questions who is Ron to determine who is successful or interesting.
Which is the core issue with subjective gatekeeping.
Right. And Nick points out the practical fallout. If the board blocks buyers who need financing, it actively harms current owners who might want or need to sell their units one day.
Which shrinks the buyer pool to almost nothing.
Exactly. Nick concludes that Ron's vision for the community comes with extraordinary liability. So what does this all mean? If a board member puts a desire to return to exclusionary policies in writing, does the entire community suddenly inherit that legal risk?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you're synthesizing two totally conflicting definitions of protecting the building. Ron genuinely believes he's protecting the building, by physically fortifying it and curating the wealth of its owners.
He thinks he's the hero saving the concrete.
Yeah. But Nick believes Ron is actively endangering the building by creating a paper trail of potential housing discrimination and limiting the resale market.
Because if they get sued for discrimination based on that email, the legal fees could bankrupt the association.
Exactly. The D&O insurance, the directors and officers policy might not even cover it if there's documented intent to skirt fair housing laws. Both sides believe they're acting in the building's best interest, even as their methods violently clash.
It's wild. It really brings everything together because these emails aren't just like a petty neighbor dispute over noise complaints.
No, not at all.
They are a profound debate over the soul of a community. On one hand, you have the harsh realities of coastal maintenance and insurance. The math is brutal.
The math doesn't lie.
Right. But on the other hand, you have the serious ethical and legal dangers of gatekeeping who gets to live there. So think about your own neighborhood or building. Where's the line between maintaining high standards and crossing into exclusionary practices?
And that leaves us with a really provocative final thought to mull over. If the sheer cost of climate resilience and insurance requires a building to be entirely populated by the ultra-wealthy just to keep the roof on, are coastal communities destined to become gated fortresses by default, regardless of what the board's official policies are?
Thank you for listening and for taking the time to look a little closer. This is The Board Next Door, the podcast. Until next time.